This year the award is going to Baba Shiv. Baba, would you come up and join me at the podium? So Baba Shiv is the Sanwa Bank Limited Professor of Marketing and a Director of the Strategic Marketing Management Executive Program. The Robert K. Jadeke Silver Apple Award is an annual award presented to a member of the GSB faculty for his or her contributions to alumni relations, with special emphasis on faculty support and participation in Stanford Business School Alumni Association programs. Baba has given countless talks and met with hundreds of alums throughout the US and the world, including Argentina, Australia, China, Chile, Denmark, France, India, and Italy. This year alone, he has 3 more trips planned over winter break in Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. Due to his ability to engage students and alums alike, his lectures and presence are in great demand, and because of this, it is a great pleasure to honor Baba Shiv with the Silver Apple Award. Thank you. Congratulations.
You can see I have my second brain here. As I grow older, I realize that I need this brain all the time, and just a few days ago, I actually lost this brain. And I just felt that, man, I just couldn't do things. So it looks like this has really become my second brain now. Anyway, what I'm going to do today is talk about decision making in general, and then get into the specifics about the GSB's or the GSBers' DNA, something that I've learned over the course of the last 5 years since I've been here. But before I do all that, a quick show of hands. How many of you would say that you are great at making decisions? Show of hands. It has to be more than that. I mean, otherwise we have failed you, right? Okay. So how many of you would say that from time to time you have trouble making decisions? Good. Okay. So let's suppose that it's one of those days you wake up and you feel that you're suffering from this disorder that is decision deficit disorder, right? Now there's no disorder like that, but who knows, with the proliferation of all these disorders, this might come into being. And on that particular day, you just wish that you could become Mr. Spock, right? That is this Vulcan character in Star Trek. Vulcans have evolved to have muted emotional circuitry, and he's portrayed to be able to make great decisions. Some of you wish that you could become Mr. Spock, and again, based not only on the portrayal in Star Trek, but also in terms of the wisdom of the ages, right? That, good decisions are ones that are made devoid of emotions. You want to rein in these emotions, and you want to make these decisions in a purely analytical fashion. Now, the question is, should you really wish to become like Mr. Spock? Or in other words, is Mr. Spock best geared to make good decisions? Now, am I in the way of anyone? You're fine? Okay, wherever I go, it's going to be a problem, right? I can do that. Now, before we answer these set of questions, is Mr. Spock best geared to become to make good decisions? We have to ask ourselves another question which is much more important, and that is, what does it mean to make good decisions, or what does it mean to make bad decisions, right? Now, to answer that question, we have to get to the decision maker's journey and then focus on what are the goals of the decision maker. Okay, so if you look at the decision maker's journey and you think about any decision that you have made, professionalized, personalized, big decisions, small decisions, you would have gone through these 3 different phases, right, or 3 different pods. The first is the predicted utility pod. So, just as an example, let us suppose that you are going to make a very senior hire for your organization, and you're faced with 2 candidates. One candidate A, she's someone who's got a lot of work experience, but maybe not that relevant, that many years of work experience relevant for your industry. The other person is someone who has got few years of work experience, but more of those years have been relevant to your industry, and you're faced with this trade-off conflict. right? Now, at that particular stage, you have to make predictions about the utility you're going to derive from these options, from these candidates, and then make up your mind. Now, keep in mind, at that point in time, you're faced with all the uncertainties. You're going to be faced with incomplete information. But based on all these predictions, you have to go ahead and make up your mind, right? That is the predicted utility part. Then comes the actual experience itself, and this is where you're going to be deriving utility from the experience, from the candidate who has been hired, and that is what is going to shape your remembered utility, right? All the memories, emotions, and all these things, the updating of your priors, and so on. That is not only going to shape your subsequent journey, because this will cycle through, but can also influence other individuals' decision journey, right? I mean, there could be a classmate of yours who calls you and say, hey, listen, you know what, I'm making the same kind of decision out here. I had to make a senior hire. How did you go about doing it? And you're going to share your wisdom. And that is going to come from the remembered utility. So now let's take a look at what should be the goals of a decision, okay, or a decision maker. If you think about it, there's one goal when you think about the predicted utility phase, especially if your decision is going to be very important, is you need to make sure that you're doing due diligence, right? That you're getting as much information out there, reducing uncertainties out there so that you're not falling prey to any biases, you're not violating some norms. I mean, there could be economic norms, some of which I've listed out there. There could be socio-cultural norms, legal norms, and so on. And for most of you in this audience, I mean, this is something that you probably will not be doing. But where you are right now, it'll be someone else who will be doing this. You'll have your staffers doing this, the legal team doing this, and so on. And this is when they're going to come in here, they're going to do the due diligence, and that's when they're going to bring the options to you. And now, you as the decision maker have to make up your mind, right? Then comes the second goal, and that is you want to emerge from that decision feeling as confident as possible, certain that you made the right pick. Why? Because if you don't do that, if you're not confident about the decision you just made, you're not going to be in a position to extract as much utility as possible from the hire that you just made. You're not going to throw in the resources to make her successful and so on and so forth, right? And this is true for any decision. If you're not kind of confident, you're not going to be extracting all this utility. So that's the second kind of goal that you have to have. You've got to emerge from the decision feeling confident. You don't want to be overconfident because you'll get into other biases, which I'll get to later on. Okay? And the third one is where you're going to have this goal about remembered utility, and that is you want to learn from your mistakes. You don't want to be blinded to information that subsequently starts coming in. Some of them can be bad, at least in terms of negative, in terms of the decision that you made. You don't want to be blinded. You want to update and so on, and move on. And therefore, you're going to shape your subsequent decision and so on. Right? I mean, if you think about the three goals that you have, predominantly it's going to be this: due diligence at the predicted utility phase. You want to emerge from the decision feeling confident, so you're able to extract this utility from the experience utility part. And then the third one is this remembered utility, where you're doing the updating and so on. Now, for the predominant chunk of my presentation, I'm going to focus on the second one. I will certainly touch upon the other two, but I'll focus on the second one. And therefore, if you focus on the second one, we can ask a very simple question. And that is, go back to Mr. Spock. Is he best geared to make confident decisions? In other words, is he going to emerge from decisions looking very confident and actually feeling confident? But that's how he's portrayed to be in Star Trek, but that could be invalid, right? So we can ask this question. And the problem about answering this question is, unfortunately, this is a fictional character. We don't have access to him, right? We can't conduct tests on him. We can't observe him making decisions. And therefore, we cannot come to our own conclusions whether the portrayal in those Star Trek episodes, in the movie, etc., is valid or not. Fortunately for us, we do have people who turn into Mr. Spocks, okay? And it'll typically happen because of an accident, a disease, or most frequently what we observe will be because of a stroke that will take away areas of their emotional circuitry. Now, you can actually now study them. You can actually observe them, what happens to them after they suffered the stroke, which has knocked off areas of the emotional circuitry, and come to our own conclusions about, is Mr. Spock best geared to emerge from a decision feeling confident or not? So that's what we're going to do. We'll start off with the first story, which is the unfortunate story of Phineas Gage, the first story about a person who became a Mr. Spock. And some of you have heard of this story before, so bear with me if you have already heard this before. So here is a gentleman. It is set in the mid-1800s, 1848 to be precise. He is a railroad worker in Vermont. Actually, he's a foreman, so he's a manager of people, doing extremely well in life. I mean, professionally, he is very polite, respectful of authority, and so on, doing reasonably well financially. He's doing extremely well socially in terms of friends and so on. Unfortunately, one day he meets with an accident. There is an explosion that drives a tamping iron, right? This is a metal rod about 1 inch in diameter, which kind of drives the tamping iron through his left cheekbone, and the tamping iron just emerges out of his skull. Jesus, right? Oh my goodness. Now, he actually, he actually survives the accident. It's crazy, think about it. He actually survives the accident, okay? And I'll get to that in just a second. Now, his skull is still preserved in one of the museums, the Harvard Medical Museum, and was subject to what is called a forensic neuroscience examination, right? So this team of researchers had access to his skull, and they could start making predictions about which soft tissues might have gotten damaged because of this accident. And what they concluded was that this accident had destroyed a very critical area of our brain's emotional circuitry, and that is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So for those of you who are familiar with or practice Buddhist meditation, this would be referred to as the third eye, right? So this is the human brain. This is where your eyeballs would be. So it's the front of the brain. This is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a very, very critical area of our emotional circuitry. Now keep one thing in mind. He had other areas of the emotional circuitry intact, especially his amygdala. Now, amygdala is the center of the brain that typically generates emotion. So you should realize that he is a person after this area of the brain got knocked off, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. His brain could still generate emotion, but his brain could not deploy these emotions when the situation so demanded. So you've got to keep that in mind, okay? Now, remember I said that he survives the accident. Of course, he's in a coma. I mean, it's so traumatic. Obviously, the person is going to be in a coma to begin with. Go for about a month, he recovers. Now, he's able to walk, he's able to talk, so this did nothing to his speech centers of the brain, his motor centers of the brain, and so on. But people began to notice a marked change in his personality. And this was documented by his doctor. If you look at his doctor's report, remember I said that he was a person who was responsible, polite, and so on, now becomes grossly profane, using bad language. A lot of this unrestrained behavior, giving to bursts of anger, right? I mean, I have been in meetings, I'm sure you've experienced this, where you really want to strangle someone, right? You're so mad. But you don't do it. You restrain yourself because of the potential consequences. He wouldn't do that. He'll get into this rage and go to strangle people. So he's able to generate these emotions, but he's not able to control these emotions, right? And the third thing that manifests, you can see in the doctor's report, that is most pertinent for the discussion at hand, is that here is a person who's simply unable to make a decision. He adopts one course of action, abandons that. Adopt another course of action, abandon that. He becomes like the proverbial Buridan's ass. Have you heard about this story? This Buridan's ass, the proverbial. Here's an ass, a donkey that was kept between two bales of hay of equal size, and it literally starves itself to death because it cannot decide which way to go. And so this accident, this damage to the emotional circuitry has made him into a Buridan's ass. Right? Now, you can see this manifesting itself. Throughout his life, he lives for another 12 years after the accident. He goes from job to job, from town to town. He cannot stick to a job. He cannot stick to a town. He moves on, finally ends up dying here in San Francisco. Okay, 12 years later after the accident. So first evidence, recorded evidence, that maybe, Mr. Spock will not be good at making confident decisions, unlike what has been portrayed in Star Trek in those episodes. Because here's a gentleman who loses an area of the emotional circuitry, and he gets into this Buridan's ass. He's not confident emerging from the decision. Now, of course, this is a data point of 1. It is anecdotal, set in the mid-1800s. We don't know what the doctor was doing, and this is all a long time ago. So, you've got to kind of take that with a grain of salt, right? Now, this is where you can see that you can examine patients now. patients who suffer, typically the patients that I have dealt with when I was at the University of Iowa before I came here, were people who will suffer a stroke. There'll be a stroke, they'll be rushed to the University of Iowa hospitals, many of them by helicopter. They'll be stabilized out there. Some of them, unfortunately, will pass on. But when the people who survive, we'll immediately go and take a full brain scan to find out which areas of the brain have gotten damaged. And what we will then ask the patient and the family members and so on is, would you like to be part of a registry? And the University of Iowa, one of the great things about that place was that it is, even today, has one of the largest registries of patients with brain damage, different areas of the brain. So we'll ask them, would you like to be part of the registry? What do you get in return is that, well, you could be brought to the hospitals at our expense every single year. Okay? You'll be put up in a hotel for 2 days, even 3 days. You'll get free diagnostic tests, and you can take part in some fun studies. And some of the studies that we would conduct, and this is a study that was done, is where you would kind of, so here is a patient who we knew was going to come to the University of Iowa hospitals. And we, beforehand, about a month before, we send a list of gift items he would like to take with him after his visit to the University of Iowa hospitals. So this patient had 2 items. One was a pen and one was a wallet. Right? That's what he equally prefers. Now he comes to the University of Iowa hospitals and he has done his diagnostic test, he has done his studies. End of the day, he's supposed to go back to his hotel, and we offer him these 2 gift items. Now, if you and I are doing this, it's a very trivial decision if you think about it. You'll examine these 2, think about it, grab one, go. The patient doesn't do that. Well, the patient, and this will happen to other patients as well, what they would do is they will examine the 2 items, they'll grab one, they'll hesitate, and then they'll go to the other one. They'll sometimes walk out of the room, come back and take the other item. Many a time they'll actually go to the hotel room and actually call us up and say, hey, when I come in tomorrow morning, can I pick up the other item? Even for a simple decision like a pen and a wallet. Okay? But keep in mind, this only happens if they're faced with a trade-off conflict. In other words, there are 2 items that are equally preferred. If one is preferred to the other, the pen and the wallet, if the pen is preferred to the wallet, no problems in making a decision. That's right. So the way these patients cope in their day-to-day lives, because they have to cope with this, is very often they'll become brand loyal. They don't want all these multiple options. Give me one option, I can go with that. Okay? So you see this happening with them. This kind of the brain, the emotional area of the brain gets. By the way, this will not show up in patients who also suffered a stroke, but that stroke didn't damage areas of their emotional circuitry. It'll only happen with patients who suffer damage to the emotional circuitry. So we have this accumulating evidence now. Phineas Gage to begin with, now these patients who have got damage to the emotional circuitry, that maybe Mr. Spock will be unable to emerge from a decision feeling confident. But these are patients. What about normal human beings? Right? Can we observe this in normal human beings as well? And you can. Not to the extent of these patients. So if I had administered a scale, what is called the affect intensity measure scale. It measures the intensity of the emotions. When you experience emotions, how intense is that emotion? I could have administered that scale out here, and what I would have gotten from that scale is a bell curve. I would have gotten a normal distribution. Some people have extreme intense emotions. Some people don't experience emotions with that intensity. Now, keep in mind, I just want to be very, very clear here, that if I do this with you out here, you will have this bell curve, but where the patients would fall will be way off the screen. So it's just relative, by the way. You still have an intact emotional circuitry, right? Now, what I can then do, once I get this bell curve, is that I can start assigning labels to people who fall on the upper end of the curve versus people who fall on the lower end of the curve. And so just for the sake of convenience, what I would do is I will label the people who fall here as emotionals. And by the way, these words have no loaded meanings at all, okay, just for the sake of convenience. And I will label these people as Vulcans. Just for the sake of convenience, there's nothing loaded out here. And what I will observe is relative to the emotionals, Vulcans will have greater trouble in emerging from a decision feeling confident. Now, here's the fun part of the story. Typically, you'll find that if I look at who constitute emotionals, there'll be a greater propensity of women falling in that category. It has happened in almost all the studies we have done. We'll look at women and they'll fall in that end of the category. And therefore, in almost all the studies that we have done, in looking at decision confidence, we'll find that women make better decisions than men do. Except there has to be except, right? Except in one context. Can you guess? Finding a partner. And I'll get to that later on because I'll tell you why this happens when I get into this arranged marriage way of making a decision versus a love marriage way of making a decision. Okay, I'll talk about that. Now the next question. If I'm going to administer the scale here among GSB students, and I'm going to administer this to the unnamed school on the East Coast, where do you think the GSBers would fall? I'm getting into the first aspect or component of the GSBers' DNA. Where do you think they would fall? Mississippi, they would. Any guesses where they fall? Consistently, they will fall on the emotional end of the spectrum. Consistently, they would fall there. And therefore, in general, you folks out here, again, and it might happen, I don't know how this happens, and maybe it's self-selection, whatnot is going on, but you'll generally see that the emotional, and therefore, in general, they'll be much more confident than students who are at other institutions or competitors. Okay? In general. And therefore, GSBs in general also will have problems with finding a partner. And to compound the fact, if you're a woman and a GSBer, oh my goodness, I mean, that's going to be crazy. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay. Okay. So, I mean, let us get behind the science of all this, but let us try to conclude what we have. All this documented evidence, what it is suggesting is the following. That, that emotion plays a very critical role in allowing us to resolve conflicts when we make our decisions and allow us to emerge from the decision feeling as confident as possible and therefore allow us to extract as much utility from the next part. That's what you can conclude from all this support, all this accumulated evidence from patients, Phineas Gage, and also with this emotional versus Vulcan categorization. The question, of course, is why? What is it about the brain's architecture that is causing this, right? Now, the way the brain goes about making decisions is not how the economists would tell you to make a decision if you're faced with a trade-off conflict. If you're faced with a trade-off conflict where you have two options, A is equal to B, what the economists would tell you to do is adopt what is called the completeness principle. The completeness principle would say, what you do is that you keep getting information, evaluating information about the two options until a winner emerges, and then pick the winner. Or if you have a deadline by which time you had to make a decision, you keep acquiring this information, and by that time, if you're still stuck with A equals B, just toss a fair coin and you should be fine. I mean, that's what the economists would say. That's the completeness principle. The brain doesn't do that. What the brain does is that it might start off the whole process. And I'm saying might underscore might because in our research, we have never found that. In all our research, we have found that right off the bat, you're going to get a process that is called predecisional distortion. But let me back up for a moment. What you'll find the brain doing, it might start off in an unbiased fashion in acquiring all this information, evaluating information. At some point in time, and very often very quickly, you'll have an emotional signal, what we call a somatic marker, that will go in favor of one of the options. And if I put you into a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, where I'm kind of monitoring the entire brain activity, we can actually observe this emotional signal. Thereafter, what the brain has created with that emotional signal is an emotional front runner. Thereafter, you as a decision maker might think that you're being rational. you are actually engaging in what is referred to as pre-decisional distortion of information. Okay? It is similar to dissonance that happens after you make a decision. It happens actually even before you made a decision, and very often happens right off the bat. Now, how do we document this pre-decisional distortion? We use a task that is called the pre-decisional distortion task. Okay, so let me explain that for a second. So let us say that you have two options, A and B. Now, let us say, go back to the example I gave. You're going to make the senior hire. You have these two candidates out there. What I will do here is that I'll present information about the two candidates, one attribute at a time. So let us say the first attribute is the number of years of work experience. That's the first attribute. I'll then ask you, based on this information, if I'm going to give you a -5 to +5 scale, with 0 being the midpoint, how much ahead is A compared to B? Okay? And let us say that in terms of years of experience, A has more work experience than B. And let us say your response as an individual is going to be a 2 on that scale, which means you're saying that based on this information, I think A is ahead of B by 2 points. I'm going to plot it on a chart like this. Second piece of information might be that this person A has worked in more diverse countries, has much more global experience than B. How important? Now you're going to ask you again, based on this information, how far ahead is A compared to B? And let us say you give a 1. I'm going to put it on this chart as a cumulative. So you see it's 2, it goes up to 3 or whatever, right? The third piece of information might be the number of years of experience relevant to your industry. And let us say there B does better than A. So you're going to say, hey, given this information, it disfavors A, I'm going to give this a -1 or -2. You see what I'm doing here? With each attribute, I'm asking you to respond to the scale, and I'm just accumulating that out there. And what will happen if I observe emotionals and I compare you with controls? Now, the control subjects go through the same task. The only difference is that instead of A and B all through the process, the first attribute will be A and B, the second will be C and D, the third will be E and F, and so on. So you can't engage in any bias out here. That will be the control. I'll do the cumulative. And if I observe what emotionals would do, you'll get this beautiful fanning out effect. And we see this reliably among GSBers. We'll find it reliably among women. This beautiful fanning out effect, which is why emotionals, if you think about it, they have already distorted, because the pre-decisional distortion, they distorted the information so much that at the end of this process, they have not just a winner, they have a clear winner, where A is not just greater than B, A is much greater than B. As a result, when they pick option A, they're very confident about the decision. Whereas if you're a Vulcan from the unnamed East Coast school, you will observe something like this and then. Of course, I'm exaggerating this. I mean, I got to do that. Okay? But it's going to be something like that. Patients will be perfectly along the green line. They won't show any distortion at all. And you can see why Vulcans have this trouble emerging from a decision feeling confident, because they're not distorting this information as much, as a result of which they come to the sixth piece of information, they're still stuck, it's almost close to one another. If they pick A, they're still not confident. At that point in time, if I say, oh, wait a second, would you like to change your mind and go to B? They'll say, okay, I'll go to B. Oh, would you like to change your mind again and go to A? Okay, I'll go to A. They'll go back and forth and back and forth. Right? Now, remember, you see that this phenomenon here, this huge kind of thing, part of the GSBS DNA, this is the same thing that can also give rise to a bias that can come to bite you as GSBers, and that is the escalation of commitment bias, where you're throwing good money, good resources after bad decisions. It's the same process. You made up your mind. Now you start getting all this negative information. What does the brain do? It just tamps it down. You become blind. You become blind to it. So I kind of advise many of these students, right, who are getting into startup mode. In fact, they already started doing that, this MBA 2s. And winter, it'll be full blown out there. I'm on advisory boards of several startups around here in Silicon Valley. My job as a mentor, as an advisor, always with GSBers is reining them in. because they will just take the idea and start running and become completely blind to all the information that is coming in that suggests that, wait a second, maybe you've got to revise your opinion about the decision you made, maybe you've got to be flexible. You won't observe that happening. And therefore, my job is to bring that thing inside. Right? Now, so if you think about it, the trick for GSBers, if you share this DNA, if you think that you share this DNA that I've just highlighted now, that is you're much more emotional on the emotional end of the spectrum than the Vulcan end of the spectrum, the trick is when to leverage emotion, the emotional side of the equation, and when to move and push the levers on the Vulcan side, right? And we'll look at how you can go about flipping the switch on the Vulcan side, because that will become relevant in certain contexts. Right? And by the way, let me also highlight the one advantage you folks have is that it is easier to switch from being an emotional to a Vulcan than the other way around. It's very difficult to move from being a Vulcan to an emotional. Okay? So let us look at some of the factors. Okay? The first factor, remember this curve, the first attribute that I presented, if you recall, was the number of years of work experience. But let us say instead of that, I had presented you with the salary that is going to be demanded. That is, the attribute was related to a number, to price. It would have turned you into a Vulcan. It would have turned you into a Vulcan. And that's why I tell people who are in sales, and I used to be in sales before I came into academia, is that the first and only rule of thumb in sales is that even if you're working for a price leader, okay, where you're pushing, never lead the charge with price, because that will turn your customer, your client, into a Vulcan. Okay? So first factor is price. So if you have a team of staffers who are doing their due diligence and you don't want them to fall prey to the bias, it behooves you to get them to focus on the numbers so that even if there are emotions out there, they will turn into Vulcans. Right? So one of them is price. Second is anything that is going to force you to become analytical. So if I'm going to force you to present information or read information in the form of charts, in the form of numbers and tables and so on, they'll turn you into a Vulcan. Now, the other factor, this is relevant again for the GSB's DNA, is what is your mindset? Okay? And here, I can categorize people as having two different mindsets. These are terms that I borrowed from statistics. If you remember your statistics from your old days, right? You'll say that you can commit two kinds of errors in statistics, right? One is a type 1 error, right? Where you're fearful of committing a mistake. You're making a decision that turns sour. That is a type 1 error. A type 2 error is where you're fearful of missing out on an opportunity. And you'll find in general, people also have these mindsets. And there are these huge individual differences. And one of the things that I have learned over a period of time about the GSB's DNA is that they'll be typically type 2 individuals. This fear of losing out on an opportunity. And you'll see this manifesting itself. And when I go to alumni reunions, especially the younger people who come over here, you kind of see that people have started a company, failed, started another company, failed, no problem, they'll show up for the reunion. You go to that other unnamed institution on the East Coast, if someone has done that, they won't show up. Because to fail, if you're a type 1 mindset, is shameful. Whereas what is shameful for the GSBer is not failure. It is someone else picking up an opportunity and running with it, and you were there in the sidelines. And that's why you come in. This is this classic GSBer's DNA, okay, which is again goes in your favor. Let me get into the last factor for the sake of completeness, and I want to kind of focus on this because this is something that you have to be very mindful of. You have everything going for you. You're on the emotional end of the spectrum, and you also have this type 2 mindset, okay, and that is sleep. Of all the factors that we have seen, one of the surefire ways you will turn into a Vulcan is not getting enough sleep. Inadequate sleep. Okay? And one of the most important, and the question is, why does this happen? It happens because if you think about sleep and look up at the different stages of sleep, there are two stages or two phases in your sleep that are critical for decision making. One is the REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and I'll tell you why that is important. And the other one is stage 3 and stage 4, that is deep sleep. Deep sleep is important because that is when all your neuromodulators are coming back to normal. Dopamine, and especially serotonin, the calming chemical. If you don't get enough deep sleep, what's going to happen is that serotonin levels come down, cortisol levels, the stress chemical, goes up, and you're going to turn into a type 1. Cortisol goes up, you become fearful of committing a mistake, right? The second one is that if you look at the REM sleep, that is when all the memories are getting what is a phenomenon called binding, right? So whatever you observed today, your holders, you listen to the talk, you've seen all this brain, the ventromedial, all these things happening out here. What is happening is that when you get into this REM sleep is when all this information starts getting bound to your previous knowledge structures. Okay? And this is also when your emotions to the various options start getting bound. And if you don't get REM sleep, you're going to be faced with options which are emotionless, and therefore you'll turn into a Vulcan. What is amazing for me is that think about the number of decisions in the world, in C-suites out there, boardrooms out there, the political arena out there, where the key players are coming to the decision with inadequate sleep. Amazes me all the time, right? Now, if I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm supposed to get done. Can someone help me out? Okay, so I have time. Maybe I should. Let me tell you a story. Okay, since I have the time. So, okay, so this is where technology comes in, and some of you have heard of this device called Zeo. Have you heard of this device called Zeo? It's a nice, I don't want to put in a plug or something, but by the way, I have nothing to do with that company, okay? I have no investment and so on, but it's a great product. So what it is essentially an EEG machine. It has got a base device, a base out there that has a clock and so on, and you wear a headband that has got 3 electrodes that measure your EEG wave throughout the entire sleep episode, okay? So it takes a sampling every 5 minutes. Now, at the end of the sleep episode, if you slept for 7 hours, 8 hours, it will tell you what percentage of the sleep was light sleep, was deep sleep, was REM sleep. So I get hold of this device and I start wearing it, right? The first day I look at it and I say, I have only 18 minutes of deep sleep in an 8-hour sleep episode. And I go, there has to be something wrong. I mean, think about it. Hey, I mean, think about it. I mean, I teach for 1 week, 1 month in a full year, and I'm done with teaching. I'm not stressed like many of you are, right? I mean, I should be getting a lot of deep sleep, but no. And I said, wait a second, you know what? Maybe something wrong with the device. That's what your first thing you do, right? I mean, you blame the device. my wife says, no, let me try it out and see how it is. And she's getting like hour of deep sleep, hour and a half. My son uses it, 10 years old, 3 hours of deep sleep. I use it again, and it's 11 minutes of deep sleep. What's going on here, right? And the nice thing about that device is that you can kind of, there's an SD card you take out of the device, get into the computer, there's a personal journal. So it asks a lot of questions like, when do you work out during the day? And I say, yeah, I work out in the mornings. And no, I work out in the afternoons. And it says, why don't you work out in the mornings? And I say, sure. And I can do it, right? I'm so flexible. I teach for only 1 month in the year. So, I mean, I can do that. So I do that. It makes a small bump, but not of a difference. And finally, as we go through all the iterations, and finally it asks me, okay, do you consume alcohol? And I said, yeah, I like to consume a glass or a couple of glasses of wine. So it says, okay, why don't you move that by an hour? Advance that by an hour. Boom. Goes from 18, 20 minutes to 30, 35 minutes. Just straight off the bat. And then it says, move it down to the hour. I do it. It goes up again. Right? And of course, I had to stop sometime, otherwise I'll be drinking at this point in time. but that's where I think technology is coming in terms of this. If you think about the last Tour de France, all the players, all the cyclists out there made use of that device. And you'll see the technology emerging in the future, where you're allowing technology to help you with recommendation agents, what to eat, when to do what, and so on and so forth, to improve sleep. It's called Zeo, Z-E-O. You can check it out. Anyway. So what we have discussed so far is, if your goal, and that is an important thing, I want to underscore that, if your goal in decision making is to emerge from the decision feeling as confident as possible, right? You want to make sure that you're leveraging the one part of the DNA that you have, and that is you fall in the emotional end of the spectrum. Now, there are going to be exceptions, right? There are going to be situations, we have seen them. For example, if you're doing due diligence, you don't want to fall prey to biases. You want to flip the Vulcan switch out there, right? If you're you don't want, if you think that after making a decision, you're falling prey to the escalation of commitment bias, that's again, you've got to flip the Vulcan switch. Now, what I'm going to do is present two other contexts where we have this documented evidence where being an emotional is actually going to hurt, okay? And one of them is going to be why women have trouble finding a partner, okay? But before that, I'm going to leave that as a suspense. After all, you've got to leave something for a suspense, right? But think about this one. It's a thought experiment. So let us say that you come into the study, and I'm going to tell you that you're going to make several rounds of investment decisions. I'm not going to tell you how many rounds. It's a large number of rounds. And I'm going to endow you with $20 in $1 bills. And I'm going to tell you the way the game is going to proceed is the following. On any round, you can decide to pass, in which case I'll take you to the next round. Or you could decide to invest $1. If you decide to invest $1, I'm going to toss a fair coin. Heads, you lose the investment. You lose the $1. Tails, I'm going to add $1.50 to your investment. It's almost like stocks and bonds, right? Now, what I have to do, and your goal, we're not dealing with fiduciary risk out here, we're going to say your job, your task at the end of the day is to leave the table with as much money in your pocket as possible. Given that, it is pretty obvious. Given the structure of the task, you should just keep investing in every single round, right? Because the expected value from investing is greater. It's $1.25 is much greater than expected value of not investing in this particular task. You just keep blindly investing. In other words, what you should do optimally, given this economic norm of expected values, you should just keep investing in every single round. And yet, you'll see normal individuals. And this was not documented by us. It was first documented by researchers, behavioral economists at Chicago. They had students trained in economics. They had students trained in finance. And the pattern they will manifest is like the following. They will start off close to what is optimal, and then they'll start putting on the brakes. By the time they're on to the 20th round, we run this for 20 rounds, they'll be investing in only 50% of the rounds. Now, the question is why, right? The reason this happens is that when you start this task, you know what to do. Your cognitive brain knows that I have to invest, and therefore you're going to invest. Now you invested, I'm going to toss a fair coin. There's an outcome. If you win, you go, yeah, and that's an emotion. If you lose, you go, ugh, that's an emotion. Right? Now, you get on to the next round, your cognitive brain is saying, invest, invest, invest. But you have this emotional baggage now that has come from the previous round. If it's a win, if it's a lose, you might say, oh, I won't be fearful now. If it's a win, I'm going to say, well, maybe I should, maybe I'm not, and so on and so forth, right? You can be lucky, I got lucky, I've got to be careful, and so on. All these emotions are coming in. By the time you're on to the 10th and 12th rounds, you've had some positives, you've had some negative outcomes. Positive emotions, negative emotions. And in general, unless you are a functional psychopath, and there are, believe me, functional psychopaths, for whom positive emotions will outweigh negative emotions when these two emotions will impinge on a neural structure. For most individuals, negative is going to far outweigh the positive. And so what happens? You're into the 12th round, there are some wins, some losses, there are negative, positive, all this impinging on the neural circuitry. Ultimately, the emotional side of the brain is going to say, don't invest now, don't invest, don't invest. If I stop you at that point in time and ask you what are you doing, you will come up with a story to justify your decision because you can articulate it. These emotions are all kind of guiding us at a very non-conscious level. Okay? So far, you can see this is a proposition that I can make, what I call a Frinky proposition. The class that I teach out here for only a month, every single day, 4 sections of it, is called the Frinky science of the human mind. What is Frinky? Frinky. There's no word like that, right? It's funky and freaky. Frinky. So here's a Frinky prediction I can make. I can say that if I take the same patients who had suffered a stroke which knocked off areas of the emotional circuitry. There's the actual brain damage. And I put them into this task. The same brain damaged patients who don't have this emotional circuitry will now outperform normal individuals, will outperform those economists and those finance students at Chicago. That's what I can predict, right? Now, to do that test, of course, I need to have a control which will be also people who have suffered damage because of a stroke, damage to the brain, but didn't take away areas of their emotional circuitry. These are called the lesion controls. Take them through this task. I also have the normal individuals. And what we document is something like that. You see the top curve is flat. These are the patients who suffer damage to the emotional circuitry. Then you have the other people, the normal individuals and the lesion controls show this classic kind of situation where they start off close to optimal. And then as the task begins to proceed, they put on the brakes. So here's where I have my only claim to fame. And that is appearing in a Jay Leno show. Not appearing. My research appearing in a Jay Leno show. I want to kind of share that with you. Some fun.
Now, according to a bizarre study at the Stanford Business School, now this is real. This is one of these amazing things. They say people suffering from brain damage did better at investing money than normal people. No, this is true. It's a real study. It said hospital patients with actual severe brain damage outperformed normal, healthy people in an investing contest. So if you're trying to make money in the stock market and you feel like you're banging your head against the wall, keep banging your head against the wall. Because it will get better.
My only claim to fame appearing in a Jay Leno show. Anyway. Okay, let's get into the other interesting thing now, and then we'll finish up, and hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions. And that is, if you look at systematically at women, and also we have seen this with GSBers who are on the emotional side of the spectrum, you'll see that they'll have trouble making what are called sequential decisions compared to making simultaneous decisions. So what is the difference between the two? The simultaneous decision is like an arranged marriage way of making a decision. Here, you have all the options presented to you at one shot. By the way, this is not just in finding a partner. It can happen in, for example, making an investment, private equity. You can have, either your staffers come and bring up to you 2-3 different options. So that's a simultaneous decision, right? And your job there is to pick the best among the options that has been presented, right? The goal out there is focus on what are the options that have been presented. In a sequential choice or a love marriage way of decision, it's very different what you have to do. You have an option right now, maybe an individual you're dating or so on and so forth. You have this option, and your decision right now is whether I should stick to that option or move on to the next option. And very often, if you think about it in finding a partner, finding private equity investment and so on, very often the other option is an unknown, right? You have a known bird in bush, and you're comparing that with an unknown, a known bird in hand and an unknown bird in the bush. And yet what you would do, you'll kind of go on to the next option, and then the next option, and then the next option, and so on. And therefore, in this research, the question that we ask is, if I put you through this as emotionals, and put you through, some of you through a simultaneous decision-making task, and you pick an option, some of you through a sequential decision-making task, and you pick an option, who among you is going to feel more confident after having made the decision? And what I'll systematically find out is the people who have made sequential choices, especially the emotional, will be much less confident. Now, the question is why, right? The reason this happens, if we go back to this one, is that in the sequential decision making, you have two emotions that come into play. One is hope. And it specifically happens for successful people because successful people are eternal optimists. And therefore, you think that the next option is going to be better than the present option, and there is this emotion of hope that is driving you away from the present option to the next option. Second is this emotion of fear. fear of being stuck with an inferior option, again driving you to the next option. And that is the reason you'll see this happening. Boom, boom, they'll keep going, and after they made the decision, after they make this decision, they're not confident about the decision that they made. And I call this phenomenon as the constant search for the right person, the right end of the bell curve, right? I mean, you have your present option who's falling in the 85th percentile. You should be happy with that. And then you'll move on to the next option. Why? Because you think the next option is going to be better than the present option. Life is not that kind, right? I mean, life that never delivers it in that fashion. In the 85th, the next option is going to be worse than that because that's how the bell curve is going to be is shaped. It's going to be worse off than the present option, right? Anyway, that's why I call this as the constant search for the right. Anyway, I'm done. I just want to give a few key takeaways out here from this talk. So all I'm saying is that, I mean, if there's any learning from this one is that if your goal is to be decisive and confident after emerging from a decision, first is, especially for those of you who feel that you have the GSB or DNA, is to make sure that you leverage your emotion, number one, and number two, make sure that if possible at all, try to make simultaneous decisions rather than sequential decisions. Now, if you're finding a partner, and in this culture, you can't afford to have a simultaneous choice. I mean, some people do it successfully, date multiple women, and then decide, or men, and so on. I mean, that doesn't happen. It has to be sequential, right? Now, if you're faced with that context where you're forced to make a sequential decision, then what I would advise you to do is create benchmarks. In other words, when I do this, especially in private equity, I kind of do this, is that when people are faced with sequential decisions, I'll force the decision maker to tell me what were the past successes and past failures. And what I would do is ask the person, compare this one to your past success and tell me, is it as good or better than the past? What that is doing is shifting you from a maximizer, and most of us in our lives, we are successful because we are maximizers. We want the best in life, right? It is forcing you to switch from being a maximizer to a satisficer. In other words, you're adopting now a threshold model rather than the best option model. Make sense? Now, of course, you've got to be mindful of when these emotions are going to be detrimental to your decision making. When you're doing due diligence, you don't want to fall prey to the escalation of commitment bias, when there are norms out there, and so on. And thank you very much, because I think we're done with it. Thank you.